June 7, 1944. Dawn broke over northern France, but the sun offered no warmth, only a pale, uncertain light. The air was thick with smoke and the metallic tang of fear. Somewhere in the distance, the roar of engines split the sky. Explosions shook the earth, scattering dirt and debris across the airfield, where a handful of defenders clung desperately to the ground. Amidst the chaos, one figure, barely more than a boy, stood alone at the edge of the perimeter, gripping a rifle with hands too small to fully steady it. He was the last man standing. Every comrade beside him had fallen, every defensive line had crumbled, and yet, somehow, the airfield remained, because of him. The world knew the Allies were advancing, but no one spoke of the teenage boys sent to hold vital positions, to buy precious hours with their lives. At just 15, he had been thrust into a battlefield meant for men, a place where hesitation meant death, and courage often came at the price of innocence. Before the attack, the airfield had been a hub of life and activity. Mechanics rushed between fighter planes, pilots went through pre-flight checks with precise motions born of countless drills, and supply trucks rumbled along dusty roads, bringing ammunition and food. The young boy had arrived weeks earlier, part of a hastily assembled auxiliary unit tasked with supporting the airfield's defenses. At first, he had been dismissed as too small, too inexperienced, too young. But the war did not wait. The first warning came in the form of distant rumbling. From his lookout point, he could see shadows moving along the horizon, enemy soldiers advancing in tight formations, tanks rolling like dark predators across the field. The adult soldiers around him snapped into action, barking orders and firing at the approaching line. He followed instinct and training, crouching behind crates, scanning the field for targets, hands trembling but grip firm. As the enemy closed in, the air filled with gunfire, screams, and the deafening thud of artillery. Smoke curled into the sky in thick black spirals. In moments, the defensive positions he had been assigned were overrun. One by one, the older men fell, leaving him alone. Every nerve screamed to retreat, to run to safety, but retreat was impossible. If he moved, the airfield would be lost. The planes, the supplies, the lives depending on those few hours, they would all be forfeit. And so he stayed. Minutes stretched like hours. Every crack of a rifle, every distant explosion hammered the boy's senses. His throat was dry, his hands bled. And yet, each time the enemy surged forward, he fired, aimed, and held the line. Alone, he became more than a teenager. He became the heartbeat of a position no one else could defend. Somewhere behind him, a shell exploded, sending a shockwave that knocked him off his feet. Dust filled his lungs and the world blurred. For a heartbeat, he questioned everything. Was this courage or madness? Could one boy truly hold an airfield against an army? But instinct, training, and sheer will anchored him. Slowly he rose, slowly he fired, slowly the tide held. The enemy did not know his name. They did not know he was a boy. They only saw the relentless rifle fire, the unexpected resistance, the invisible force holding back a full advance. For hours he fought, not for glory, not for medals, but because surrender was not an option. And in that moment, the fate of hundreds rested entirely on a single, terrified, determined teenager. Even as the sun climbed higher, casting light on the shattered planes and smoking wreckage, he stood, alone, unyielding, defiant. And the airfield survived. But how did he reach that point? How did a 15-year-old boy, thrown into one of the deadliest battles of World War II, become the last line of defense against a relentless army? To understand his courage, we must go back to the days before the guns, before the smoke, before he became the lone defender. He was not born a hero. He was a boy with a family, a village, a life interrupted by war. The moment when ordinary became extraordinary and fear transformed into action began long before he ever picked up a weapon. His story is one of bravery, of tragedy, of a childhood stolen, but also of the extraordinary power of human will in the face of overwhelming odds. And the moment he stood alone, with the roar of battle echoing across the field, would etch his name, unknown to most, into the history of a war that had devoured millions. How did this boy survive? How did he hold the line when all hope seemed lost? And what would become of him after the guns fell silent? Those answers lie in the moments before the battlefield, in the choices that shaped him, and in the human spirit that refused to yield, even when the world had turned to fire. The boy's name was René, though no history books would remember him at first. Born in a small village near the French coast, he had known the rhythms of childhood, sun-drenched mornings, laughter with friends, chores on the farm, until the war arrived. In 1940, German forces had swept across France with terrifying speed. Villages were occupied, roads patrolled, and every corner of life was reshaped by fear. René's parents tried to shield him, insisting he stay close to home, keep his head down, and avoid the patrols that prowled their village streets. But for a boy of 15, life in hiding was a slow suffocation. He craved purpose, to feel that he could act, even in some small way, against the tide that had swallowed his country. When the call came to reinforce airfield defenses, René did not hesitate. He lied about his age. He told them he was 16, tall enough, strong enough, disciplined enough, and perhaps he believed it himself. At the airfield, the adults scrutinized him, unconvinced, until the chaos of war revealed what they had not anticipated, a courage that could not be measured in height or experience. The airfield itself was critical, a strip of land that could launch fighters to intercept enemy bombers and protect inland towns from devastation. It was modest in size but immense in strategic importance. Trenches had been dug, barricades constructed from sandbags, and artillery positioned to cover every approach. Soldiers trained relentlessly, but they were stretched thin. Men were weary, supplies limited. Every hour, every decision could tip the balance between survival and annihilation. René was assigned a lookout post near the northern perimeter, a spot with clear sightlines across the landing strips and fields beyond. His role was simple in theory: observe, report, and defend. In practice, it was terrifying. From his vantage point, he could see enemy patrols moving at the edges of the horizon. He could hear the distant hum of transport trucks carrying weapons, hear the murmur of soldiers, voices like ghosts on the wind. It was during these early weeks that René learned the rhythms of fear. Nights were the hardest. He would lie in a shallow trench, listening to the cries of distant villages, the occasional scream from soldiers on patrol, the whisper of leaves and the howl of wind across the fields. Sleep was a luxury. Every sound was a warning, every shadow a potential threat. And every morning he returned to his post with the same rigid determination, gripping a rifle that felt too heavy for his frame but was now an extension of his will. The tension escalated as reconnaissance reports indicated a looming attack. Enemy forces were massing several kilometers away. The soldiers at the airfield knew the assault was inevitable. The higher command emphasized the importance of holding the line, even if it cost lives. To them, the airfield was a lifeline. To René, it was something more. It was a place where he could finally act, where fear could be transformed into purpose. In the days leading up to the battle, René moved like a shadow among the trenches. He observed supply lines, memorized enemy flight paths, and practiced with his rifle until his shoulders ached. The adults began to notice something remarkable. This boy, so young, absorbed instructions with an intensity most men lacked. He listened, he watched, he adapted. He became indispensable, not because of his age, but because of his attention, his courage, his refusal to be broken by the invisible pressure that weighed on every soldier at the edge of the continent. Then one gray morning, the first rumble came, not the usual distant patrols or reconnaissance planes, but a sustained, coordinated advance. Enemy tanks appeared first, rolling like steel beasts across the fields. Infantry followed, moving in synchronized waves. Artillery fire preceded them, shaking the ground, sending birds scattering into the pale sky. The defenders scrambled into position. René climbed into his lookout post, rifle ready, breath shallow but steady. The adults glanced at him, a mixture of concern and admiration in their eyes. They knew the coming hours would test every skill, every nerve, but none could predict what was about to unfold, or the role a single, determined teenager would play in holding the line when the world seemed poised to collapse around him. For René, the battlefield was no longer abstract. It was immediate, intimate, alive with danger. Every sound, every shadow, every distant explosion demanded focus. And when the first shots rang out, when the first of his comrades fell, the airfield became a crucible, a place where courage, fear, and destiny collided. The stage was set. The enemy advanced. and the moment that would define him and the airfield itself was about to arrive. The first shells fell just before noon. The ground trembled under their impact, sending clouds of dust and soil into the air. Smoke curled from overturned trucks and shattered crates of ammunition. The airfield, once a place of disciplined movement and careful preparation, became a chaotic tableau of fear and urgency. René crouched behind a barricade of sandbags, rifle in hand. His pulse raced, every nerve screaming with anticipation and terror. The first wave of enemy infantry advanced across the open ground, rifles glinting in the pale sunlight, boots pounding the dirt. The older soldiers opened fire immediately, their shots ringing out in sharp bursts. The boy followed suit, aiming carefully, squeezing the trigger, feeling the recoil jolt through his small frame. He could see them clearly, the enemy soldiers, determined and precise, moving in coordinated formations. Some fell instantly, others pressed forward undeterred. The airfield's defenses were holding, but only just. The cacophony of gunfire, explosions, and shouted commands created a living storm around him, each second a test of endurance and courage. By the second wave, casualties mounted. René's unit, stretched thin and exhausted, began to falter. Men fell beside him, clutching rifles, crying out, and then silence. The boy's heart pounded as he dragged himself to the next position, taking cover, returning fire, refusing to give an inch. Every movement carried the weight of responsibility, not just for the airfield, but for the planes, the pilots, and the men and women depending on this fragile line. At one point, a tank rumbled forward, its cannon firing with terrifying precision. The soldiers attempted to hold it off, but it crushed barricades and tore through defenses with ease. René ducked, heart hammering, hands raw from gripping his rifle. The adults fell back, shouting orders, trying to regroup, but one by one they were cut down, leaving gaps in the line. And then it happened, he was alone. Alone! For a moment, the world narrowed to a single point. The boy, the rifle, the advancing enemy. Every instinct screamed to flee. Every thought screamed that he could not possibly hold this position. And yet, he stayed. Every shot he fired became a lifeline, every movement a barrier against the relentless tide. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time lost meaning. Smoke thickened, obscuring vision, and the smell of gunpowder and blood filled his lungs. The sky above was a churn of smoke trails and distant aircraft, engines screaming as they streaked across the horizon. René could hear the crackle of bullets, the shouts of soldiers, and the thud of distant artillery, all layered together into a symphony of chaos. Somehow, against all odds, the boy continued to hold. Enemy soldiers hesitated as they encountered this unexpected resistance. Some fell, some retreated. He moved from position to position, firing, retreating, advancing, each motion instinctive, born of training, fear, and an unyielding will to survive. The airfield, battered and smoking, began to stand firm once more, a fragile testament to his determination. By late afternoon, the enemy had stalled. Their advance slowed, fractured. The boy, exhausted, bleeding, and barely able to lift his rifle, realized that he had held the line. He was the last defender remaining. Around him lay the cost, fallen comrades, shattered defenses, and the smoke of battle. Yet the airfield still stood. The planes, the supplies, the lifeline of hundreds, preserved by a single, determined teenager. And in that moment, as the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the battlefield, René understood the paradox of his survival. He had been at the very edge of death, yet his courage had forged a fragile victory. The world beyond the airfield would never know his name, yet history had already been shaped by his actions. But survival came at a price. The physical toll was immense, but the psychological scars would linger far longer. René had witnessed the loss of friends, the destruction of the airfield he had sworn to protect, and the sheer, unrelenting weight of human mortality in war. And yet, even in the midst of despair, there remained a thread of hope, a reminder that courage, no matter how small or young, could change the course of history. This was only the beginning. The story of René, the boy who became the last man standing, would continue, not just in the hours of battle, but in the aftermath of war, in the reckoning of memory, and in the quiet moments where heroes are remembered in silence. When the guns fell silent, a strange stillness blanketed the airfield. Smoke curled into the sky, carrying the acrid scent of burned earth, torn metal, and spent gunpowder. Birds, once hidden by the chaos, began to return, their hesitant chirps echoing over the flattened landscape. René slumped against a shattered sandbag, rifle clutched loosely in his hands. His uniform was torn, dirt-streaked, soaked with sweat and blood. Every limb ached, every breath felt like fire in his lungs, and yet he was alive. Against impossible odds, he had survived. He looked across the airfield. Wrecked planes lay scattered, their wings bent like broken birds. Craters pocked the tarmac, a testament to the ferocity of the attack. And in the silence, he realized the full weight of what he had endured. The men who had fought beside him, now gone, the enemy forces, repelled but still formidable, the fragile line he had defended, preserved only through sheer determination. Officers and soldiers who had been forced to retreat returned cautiously, surveying the damage. Their eyes widened as they took in the lone figure at the edge of the perimeter, rifle at his side, standing amidst the wreckage like a sentinel who had refused to yield. Whispers spread quickly. The boy, he held them. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others approached him with tentative awe, offering words of gratitude he could hardly comprehend. For René, there was no elation, no sense of triumph, only a profound exhaustion and the creeping weight of grief. He had survived, but at what cost? Every face lost, every cry he could not answer, haunted him even as relief washed over the airfield. He felt a disconnect, a strange gulf between his survival and the destruction around him. It was a moment that would define him, though he did not yet understand it. The commanding officers moved quickly to stabilize the airfield. Reinforcements arrived, and medical teams attended to the wounded. René was ushered into a makeshift infirmary, his injuries treated with efficiency but little ceremony. The adults around him spoke in clipped, urgent tones, trying to focus on the broader mission. And yet, in the quiet corners of the tent, the whispered stories of the boy who had stood alone began to circulate. As night fell, René lay on a cot, staring at the canvas above him. The events of the day replayed relentlessly, the enemy advance, the cries of his fallen comrades, the recoil of his rifle, the trembling hands that would not let go. He was a boy in a man's world, shaped by violence, thrust into responsibility, and forced to act when instinct and courage collided. Sleep came fitfully. His dreams were haunted by echoes of battle, explosions, shouts, and the ghostly figures of the men who had fallen beside him. Yet amidst the terror, there were moments of clarity, moments when he could see that his actions had mattered, that he had made a difference. The airfield survived because he refused to yield. Hundreds of lives had been preserved in part by a single, determined teenager. In the following days, René was questioned, debriefed, and observed by officers who struggled to reconcile his age with the scale of his actions. He spoke little, mostly recounting the facts, where he had been, what he had done, who had fallen. And yet, beyond the tactical importance, they recognized something deeper, a quiet resilience, a clarity of purpose, and a moral courage that was rare even among seasoned soldiers. Despite the accolades and whispered reverence, René grappled with his own sense of self. How does a boy process being a hero? How does he reconcile the exhilaration of survival with the sorrow of loss? These questions would follow him long after the airfield was repaired, long after the battle became history, lingering in the quiet moments when war had faded into memory, but its echoes remained. The airfield would endure, strengthened by repairs and reinforced defenses, but the story of René, the boy who had become the last man standing, would remain etched in the hearts of those who witnessed it. A reminder that courage is not measured by age or experience, but by the willingness to act when all seems lost. Even as life slowly returned to the airfield, René knew something fundamental had changed within him. He had faced the abyss and held firm. He had survived the impossible, and the war, indifferent to personal sacrifice, would continue. But he had proven, in those crucial hours, that even the youngest, the smallest, and the most unlikely could shape the course of history. The war continued, but for René, nothing would ever feel the same. The airfield had been held, planes still launched into the skies, and soldiers carried on with their duties, but the boy who had been at the center of it all carried scars that no battlefield could erase. In the months that followed, René was quietly moved from frontline duties to support roles. The officers insisted he was too valuable to risk in open combat again, but the boy himself did not care. He had already seen too much. Every loud noise reminded him of the barrage of artillery. Every sudden movement, every shadow, triggered memories of the men who had fallen beside him. Sleep remained elusive, haunted by screams and flashes of fire. His courage was celebrated in hushed tones among the troops. Letters were sent, commendations noted, yet the wider world remained unaware. Newspapers wrote of major battles, strategic victories, and heroic generals, but a 15-year-old who had held an airfield alone was a story too small, too human, to fit into the sweeping narratives of war. Still, the soldiers who survived that day never forgot him. Pilots who took off from the airfield remembered the boy at the perimeter, rifle raised, standing firm against an entire enemy advance. Engineers, medics, and commanders who rebuilt the site spoke of his actions in reverent whispers. And in those quiet moments, René's heroism became a symbol, proof that courage could emerge from the most unexpected places and that age did not define the capacity for sacrifice. For René, the years after the war were a strange mixture of relief and emptiness. He returned to his village, which had survived but been scarred by occupation. The fields were still there, the houses mostly intact, but the innocence of childhood had been lost forever. He attempted to resume a normal life, helping on the farm, attending school, laughing with friends, but the memory of the battlefield lingered, etched deep into his mind. Every plane overhead, every sudden explosion brought him back to that day. Back to the smoke-filled airfield, where he had been the last line of defense. Decades later, historians would uncover fragments of his story, piecing together the courage of a boy who defied the odds. Veterans recounted the day with vivid clarity, describing a teenager who had fired with precision, moved with instinct, and refused to surrender even when surrounded by death. René's name, once unknown beyond a handful of witnesses, slowly emerged in historical records, a quiet testament to the human capacity for courage in the darkest hours. Yet even with recognition, the emotional weight remained. René had given up a normal adolescence, and no medal or story could restore what had been lost. The men and boys who fight wars often carry invisible wounds, and René were no exception. The image of his comrades falling, the sound of relentless artillery, and the surreal horror of being alone against a powerful enemy haunted him, a shadow he would live with for the rest of his life. In reflecting on that day, René spoke rarely, but always with the same clarity. Courage is not born from the desire for recognition. It is forged in moments where fear threatens to paralyze, where every instinct tells you to run, but where the choice to act defines the fate of many. He did not think of himself as a hero. He thought of the airfield, of the planes, of the lives that depended on him, and he did what had to be done. History would remember generals and major offensives, but for those who knew the story, the truth was clear. A 15-year-old boy, armed only with courage and a rifle, had altered the course of battle. The airfield survived because he refused to yield, and in that refusal, he left a legacy that endures, a reminder that sometimes the smallest figures carry the heaviest burdens, and that extraordinary courage often emerges from the most unlikely of places. René lived the rest of his life quietly, carrying memories of bravery, loss, and resilience. He rarely spoke of the war, but when he did, he focused not on himself, but on the friends he had lost, the people he had protected, and the fragile beauty of human courage in moments of unimaginable darkness. And though the world moved on, the story of the boy who was the last man standing remained a silent, enduring testament to the power of the human spirit. Decades after the war, those who had witnessed René's stand would gather quietly in small reunions, exchanging stories in hushed tones. Pilots, mechanics, and medics, once strangers thrown together by circumstance, remembered the boy who had defied death. Their words painted a picture of someone extraordinary, not because of sheer strength or training, but because of an unshakable will that seemed far beyond his years. One moment we were retreating, a former pilot recalled, voice trembling slightly. The next there he was, a boy firing, holding them back. I don't know how he did it. We had nothing left, but he wouldn't let the line break. Another soldier spoke of the surreal contrast. He looked 15, barely taller than my rifle, yet there was a fire in him that didn't belong to someone that age. You watched him, and for a moment, fear didn't exist, only resolve. Historians later reflected on the rarity of René's story. Teenagers were present in many conflicts, but to be entrusted with a frontline defensive position, to act decisively under fire, and to survive against overwhelming odds that was almost unheard of. He embodied a stark truth of World War II. The war did not distinguish between men and boys. It demanded courage from anyone who could stand, and sometimes it revealed heroes in the most unlikely forms. For René himself, recognition was never the point. In interviews decades later, he spoke sparingly, often pausing, his gaze drifting as if seeing the battlefield again. "I did what I had to do," he said simply. "It wasn't bravery, it was necessity. The others, they were counting on someone. I was there, I stayed." Yet the memories lingered relentlessly. Every sudden sound, every mechanical roar reminded him of that day. Sleep often evaded him. Dreams were haunted by flashes of fire, the echoing cries of friends, and the surreal dissonance of a boy standing alone against an army. The psychological weight of being the last line of defense had never fully lifted. Even as he built a life after the war, marriage, children, work in the village, the quiet moments brought him back to that shattered airfield, to the tension, fear, and responsibility he had borne. And still there were glimmers of pride, fleeting but profound. He had acted when most would have frozen, when adults had fallen, when the world seemed to have abandoned hope. The airfield survived because of him. Hundreds of lives were spared. History's course had shifted in those crucial hours, shaped by one boy's unwavering will. René's story also became a bridge to understanding the countless unnamed teenagers who fought in World War II. From the occupied towns of France to the forests of Poland, the youth who were forced to grow up in the shadow of death displayed courage that went largely unnoticed. René was extraordinary, but he was also a representation of thousands whose stories were never told, whose bravery was invisible yet essential to survival. In reflecting on his life, René would often return to one idea: courage is not born from the desire for recognition. It is forged in moments where fear threatens to paralyze, where every instinct tells you to run, but where the choice to act defines the fate of many. He did not see himself as a hero. He saw himself as a boy who had done what had to be done because the world depended on it. By the end of his life, René's story was preserved through memoirs, interviews, and the recollections of those who had witnessed his stand. His name became a quiet legend among military historians, a human testament to the extraordinary power of will, determination, and bravery. The teenager who had been the last man standing was no longer forgotten. And though the war eventually faded from memory for the world at large, René's courage remained a touchstone, a reminder that heroism does not always come in the form of generals, medals, or grand speeches. Sometimes it comes from a boy who refused to yield, from small hands gripping a rifle, from a heart that would not surrender even when all seemed lost. The airfield survived, hundreds of lives were spared, and one boy, thrust into circumstances no child should ever face, became a symbol of hope, resilience, and the extraordinary power of human courage. René passed away quietly many years later, but the story of his stand, the fear, the determination, the loneliness, and the ultimate triumph endures. It lives in the whispers of the wind across fields once scarred by war, in the plains that still take to the skis, and in the silent understanding that courage can emerge even from the smallest, most unlikely of places.